Hi, I'm Alix Edwards from TRL, and I'll be presenting about making buses safer and greener for all, along with my colleague Richard Harrington from Go Ahead London. I'm going to give a very brief overview of the bus safety standard, and then we're going to dive into a bit more detail on a handful of the measures that were implemented and talk about them a bit more in terms of the technical steps that were taken, and then Richard will give his experience as an operator in terms of implementing those changes. Overall, the bus safety standard is an initiative launched by Transport for London back in October 2018, based on the research programme that TRL has led. It's focused on their Vision Zero, which you can see the timeline and their targets along the top there. And they're working on the bus safety standard as part of an overall programme, Safe Systems Approach. The vehicle's focus is this bus safety standard for them. Back in 2017, whilst we were doing the research work into this standard, the biggest problem at the time for bus casualties in London was the vulnerable road users, so the pedestrians and cyclists. And sadly, they were coming off worst. So most of the safety measures that were implemented were focused around addressing those casualties in some way. This slide is showing an overview of all the different safety measures that were involved in the standard, are involved in the standard. These cover, there's a fair chunk of them focused on helping the driver to avoid incidents, but also looking at the other partners, so people and other vehicles around the bus, outside of the bus, and helping them to avoid getting into incidents as well. And then, of course, helping to protect people, be they other road users or the people on board the buses, the occupants as well, protecting them if an incident does actually occur. So the research process that we used was covering looking at the detail of the casualties and the scenarios in which those incidents occurred, looking at the technical options that can be implemented on buses, whether it's vehicle features or like safety systems being added in, and trying to evaluate which one or which of those would be the most effective at addressing the casualty problems, and then going through and designing a performance-based specification and test and assessment procedure for TfL to make these requirements of their bus fleet, and it's focused on new buses and a handful of retrofit. And we also developed that that selection of measures was based on a big cost-benefit model, looking at which ones would have the greatest effect on the casualties. And then, of course, it's really important to consider the timelines of when these things, the features are going to be available on buses, and when they can actually be realistically implemented. So we used all of this information to generate a roadmap of when the requirements are going to be made by TfL. You can see there's quite a lot of different safety measures on there. They've already launched and have a number of buses on road with the 2019 specification. There's a further set of requirements for 2021 and again for 2024. So it's like a rolling programme of safety requirements. And then Richard and I are just going to talk in a bit more detail about some of those individual safety measures. So intelligent speed assistance is supporting the driver by not allowing them to speed. So it's an electronic system which uses the GPS position of the bus and knows, so the bus knows where it is, and it knows by looking at a digital speed limit map what the road speed limit is, and then just prevents the driver from applying any further acceleration. Doesn't interfere with the braking, but prevents any additional acceleration over and above the speed limit. So that's been in place as a requirement for a number, since 2019 now, and TfL's monitoring of that system is showing that they've actually achieved an 80% reduction in speeding on the equipped routes in this case. So, Richard, do you want to talk a bit more about your experience with ISA?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's great that that word assistance is used there, because these items that are put in are there to assist drivers, not take control or responsibility away from them. We conducted a trial with TfL 4 to 5 years ago when this was initially being looked at, and some of the learnings from that were other road users. So they weren't necessarily obeying the speed limits. They'd seen the bus go at a slower speed, they're trying to overtake, and there were cameras mounted on buses, so we could sort of see what was going on. And as a result of that, as well as the training of the driver, it's also the training of the other road users as well. So you can see there these vinyls put on the back, letting people know that actually this bus is doing the speed limit. It's restricted to the local speed limit, and you're hoping that will then influence other people's behaviour when they're driving vehicles. That bit about training is imperative, that if you're putting anything new onto a vehicle, not only do you introduce a control measure that you're putting in, you don't want to introduce another hazard. So you must train them so they understand what that technology is doing. One of the other things it threw up in our experience was some of the passengers were actually complaining to the drivers at the speed that they were driving. So there are vinyls that are going to go inside, and more communications getting out to the passengers as well. So actually this vehicle is limited to, I mean, it's not that often in London you can drive over the speed limit anyway because of the amount of traffic, but certainly at night and out of hours we're finding that. That point about introducing other risks and hazards, that led, we have a big thing in London or in the industry with pedal confusion. So after speaking with TfL and TRL, we managed to get a pedal indicator light to assist the driver again. So actually, when you're looking at hybrids and electric vehicles, pedal confusion becomes more apparent because they don't necessarily understand what pedal they're on all the time. As years ago with a diesel bus, you took your foot off the accelerator, your first 20% of travel on the brake was retardation, electromagnetic braking. Now it works in reverse. As your foot comes off the accelerator, you're regenerating power and the bus gets the same feeling that it's slowing down. And that can quite easily confuse the driver. So when you're then putting in things like ISA as well, that's just adding confusion to the mind. So putting the pedal indicator light has helped the drivers understand what pedal they're in, as well as the training to give them. Then we looked at brake toggling, and brake toggling is now out there. So before the driver, when he comes to a stop, before he pulls away and gets acceleration, he must dip the brake pedal twice, and that gives them reassurance to understand what pedal they're using. So it's been accepted. Drivers understand that actually this is not just helping them drive the vehicle or control it at the correct speeds, it's protecting their licence as well, which is their living.
Great. So yeah, just those pedal confusion incidents, that's where the driver's brain gets confused as to what pedal they're using. And those measures have been implemented on the basis that they're addressing, thankfully, very rare incidents, but they could, unfortunately, perhaps lead to very severe incidents. You know, a driver was accelerating for a long time by accident, maybe go into a crowd or something like that. It's about reducing the risk of those very severe incidents. So that was the rationale for doing that piece of work in terms of TfL selection. And then thinking again about assisting the driver in avoiding these incidents, we've got work, Lily earlier in the conference has mentioned about the direct vision standard for heavy goods vehicles and how that's being applied in London freight, but that has also been applied through the bus safety standard to buses, because it just made complete sense to use the same approach. But we were able to also make an innovative extension to that to also include the indirect vision, so what you can see via mirrors and cameras, that kind of thing. So there's just a little illustration there showing the view of the rearward view. And perhaps, Richard, you could talk a bit more about how the camera monitoring systems have come in, because I know there was an intention to reduce the risk of casualties from head strikes, from wing mirror head strikes to pedestrians. Obviously, we can remove those. We remove the wing mirrors. So perhaps you give your experience there.
Sure. Yeah. So this has been more a process of evolution over years. So if you look at pictures from London buses 10 to 12 years ago, they all had much smaller black mirrors on, which were very hard for pedestrians to see at night in particular, and hard for the drivers to judge. So TfL changed their specification and put high visibility yellow mirrors on, a bit like the one you see there, but they were single mirrors. And that helped passengers when buses were put into bus stops to recognise that there was a mirror coming their way. I mean, you'd have to be an exceptionally tall person, but it happened from time to time where someone will get caught by a mirror. Then, as a result of our risk competition about 4 or 5 years ago, one of our entries, we hold this competition every year and ask our colleagues to suggest ideas that can assist their colleagues. And one of them come up with the cycle safe mirror you can see in the picture there, where it gives you 2 different views. And it wasn't popular with every one of them, but the majority of drivers could see the benefits of it. And TfL accepted the design and actually then put it into their bus specification. So every bus in London now has this kind of mirror on it, other than the latest versions, which are the CMS, which is the camera monitoring system you can see on the right there, and that takes completely away the mirror and the mirror arm. Now, it did leave us with some faults in the first instance. So the driver, instead of looking from his left to his right or her left to her right across that screen to look at the mirrors, they are looking at monitors that are much closer together. But that's far outweighed by the benefits of the clarity of the picture. So when we first talked about putting them in, a lot of the union reps and drivers were saying this will never work, it's not going to be great. One, the technology will break down regularly, and 2, it's not going to give us such good vision. And I wouldn't say they were anti it, but very, very suspicious of it. So we made a point of taking those reps and mentors up to the factory to see these in build. And every one of them, as soon as they sat in the seat, it was oh wow, yeah, that is unbelievable. The most negative, couldn't find anything wrong with it. We took them into the water test bay where water comes down much harder than any rain ever would. And if you've got a mirror on the side, you can't even see the mirror, let alone into the mirror. But these CMS systems, you had full vision of the vehicle. So in the rain, in the dark, they give you much better vision, and in the sunlight as well. So when it's really sunny and the sun reflects off that mirror, it doesn't off these systems. And then things that they're going to, so this is again evolution, what they're going to develop. So the generation 2, when you put your indicator on, it will predict a line that comes out from the back of your vehicle and then at a predetermined gap, so say 10 meters back. So if the driver puts his indicator on to move and sees there's a car in that area coming up alongside him, he'll know how close it is to them, and it helps that decision making. So it's been something that's been really well accepted.
That's great to hear. Moving on then, to some, picking up the theme of developments for the future really, there's another driver assist measure, which is advanced emergency braking. This is where there's sensors on the bus looking ahead of the vehicle, and if there's a car or a pedestrian or cyclist ahead and there's a risk of in an emergency situation, a risk of a collision, and the driver doesn't appear to be braking and taking action to avoid it, then at the very last emergency milliseconds, the system will step in and give a warning and give actually apply braking. So I think if I click this, it will show you that in action. The challenge in this situation is the false positives. So if the sensors believe that there's an impending incident when there isn't actually one, then potentially that bus is braking when it didn't need to. And then you've got a situation where there might be a risk of, somebody being injured on board the bus, a passenger having a bump or something like that. Overall, though, the cost, the modelling and estimations we did about the benefits of avoiding severe car accidents and avoiding pedestrian and collision cyclist incidents versus the very small, very unlikely risk that the system intervenes falsely, basically showed that it was still worth doing for TfL, and that's why it's been put on the roadmap. It's actually down there for 2024, which is in the future because it's taking time for the bus industry to develop these systems, and obviously it will take the operators time to implement that as well. And our research work is ongoing, looking at producing better data to look at that modelling work and to better support the implementation. So perhaps, Richard, could you add some more thoughts about that future with the AUB?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got this on buses yet, but it's quite clearly on other industries. It's on coaches, it's on trucks, it's certainly on my car. And if it works out, I don't see why it won't work on buses. We're not trying to take over from the driver. Again, this is all about assistance, giving as much assistance as we can. I think you rightly raised the point about false positives. So actually, goes back to my point about introducing a control measure without giving you a higher risk. So actually, if the thing's going off every 2 minutes going down the road and throwing all our elderly passengers onto the floor, then we need to review what it's doing. But of course, we are looking at the interior of the vehicles to make those safer as well. So I can see this will be a positive going forward.
Great. Yeah, and the interior protection is another measure, of course, that's on the bus safety standard. But we don't have time to discuss that right now. Instead, we're going to talk about acoustic vehicle alerting system, which is a great example of the connection between making buses safer and greener. So part of reducing emissions on buses is around perhaps using electric buses, and they are much quieter running. So at very low speeds, it's basically very hard to hear them. As the speeds are higher, over 20 miles an hour, then the road noise and the tyre noise takes over, and they're easy for pedestrians to identify. But the idea is, in this situation, that the AVAS brings in an additional sound. It's a sound unit mounted at the front of the bus and emits a sound to compensate for that very quiet running at very low speeds. And that's actually come in as a regulatory requirement. And what TfL have actually done is adopt it much sooner, ahead of the regulation requirement. And that was based on the test development that we've done, and then working with other partners. TfL have generated this urban bus sound. The goal of that is to make all the buses, regardless of who they're built by or who they're operated by, they all sound the same across the whole of London, so there's no risk of confusion for the pedestrians. And I know that TfL's work is ongoing in this, developing the sound, thinking about the sound in different environments, different background noises, thinking about garages and things like that. So, Richard, I know you're involved in running some of these buses that have got AVAS at the moment, so perhaps you could elaborate.
Sure. I mean, this is about understanding why we need it, and then doing the work in trial to understand some of the effects that aren't so good. So, for instance, Waterloo Garage, the first all-electric garage outside of China, it's in the middle of flats and houses all the way around it. And when we converted the garage to all-electric, my neighbours loved me because you were taking away all the poisonous emissions and all the noise at 6 o'clock in the morning when the buses roll out. And of course, if we put AVAS on vehicles and it competes with other vehicles to make a noise, you'll have this crescendo with 50 odd vehicles starting up in the morning, and it will wake absolutely everyone up, and I won't be popular at all. So that was one of the things that had to be considered, as well as ensuring that it didn't interfere too much with the drivers and the passengers of the vehicle. So proper insulation was required inside the bus. But then when you look at things like the second route that we electrified was Route 360. And for those of you that know South West London, will know what Exhibition Road goes down the side of the National Museum. And Exhibition Road has absolutely no road guards on it at all. It has no pavement and curbstones. It's a flat road. And we're putting a silent bus go down there. And everyone that's walking down there is either a tourist, so they're probably looking the wrong way down the road anyway, or they're looking for the National Museum on their phones and following Google, so their heads are down, so they're not looking for a bus. So we have to make noise to protect people. Now, to date, we haven't had a complaint from passenger, pedestrian or driver, and we've got it on a number of our vehicles now.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear. And yeah, again, another measure that's addressing pedestrian casualties in particular, and there's a suite of safety measures as we've been talking through. But this conference is about making reduced emissions as well. So I know Go Ahead London's got a big portion of fleet that is low emission now. So Richard, do you want to tell us more about that?
Okay, so zero emissions. So we first started this journey in 2011 and going to places like Kortrijk, the bus show in Belgium for 2 years. We were looking for electric vehicles after speaking to our one customer, TfL, about what the future might look like. Most of the buses that were battery operated then resembled milk boats, and the technology wasn't much further away from that. So you had to kind of scour the world really, and we met up with a manufacturer that said that they could produce an electric vehicle in the TfL specification, ready for a trial in 2013, and they did, and we ran it from the Waterloo garage by pure coincidence, because the routes in that garage particularly suit EV environment where it was very short journey times. So we put them through every duty, realised it worked, and by pure coincidence, that was the first route to come up from the Mayor of London's ultra low emission zone. The two routes that we run from there came up for tender, and we had to bid to turn those to full electric in 2016. So absolutely no reference book or guide on how to do this, a massive learning curve for us. But it was successful. As I said before, it was the first full electric garage, and we now operate well in excess of 200 electric vehicles, and I have another 55 that are currently being delivered as we speak. So that's led to us operating well in excess of 14 million zero emission kilometres, which is a real statement. This technology works hand in hand with the bus safety standard. We are saving 120, and using the data that's supplied from the low vehicle carbon partnership certification criteria, and we're saving 120 tonnes of CO2 each week. That's equivalent, comparing it to an equivalent Euro 6 diesel vehicle. And in total, that means we've saved 9,214 tonnes of harmful CO2 from the streets of London.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. So just to conclude then, we've got a few other highlights down the right-hand side there about TfL's fleet, about improving the safety specifications and reducing the emissions as well. And I hope everyone's appreciated along the way that buses can actually be safer and greener. Achieving that takes research to make sure that the safety standards and specifications being implemented are actually going to really address those casualties that are happening on the roads. And the engagement with the industry and the input from the operators is essential along the way to make sure that these things are actually workable and practical, and build in that feedback and that experience to make sure that it's all being done correctly. And then I guess round off with, where does it go from here? Obviously, it's an ongoing process, as Richard mentioned earlier. It's an evolution. So the bus safety standard, I hope, will keep progressing and keep adding more safety measures in there. The other thing we can do, of course, is add more cities and have them using the same standards. It could be different territories, countries, regions. If we all adopt this approach of safer and greener buses, then we'll start to, see really good casualty and emissions reductions. But it does take time to roll through into the fleets. So basically, the sooner the better, really. Richard, anything else?
Just to add that we're seeing some of these items being fitted, not just in London, but outside of London. Like everyone will be led by the data. What it's telling us, if there's less accidents, that's less people getting hurt, and that's less cost. So therefore, it's a no-brainer. Why wouldn't you use them?
Brilliant. And then just to finish off, we've got our contact details there, and if anybody wants to get in touch and ask for more information, then do feel free. Thank you very much.
Thank you.